Well, we are delighted to have General Rawat with us. Of course, he served as Army Chief before his current role, and we all know him as a soldier par excellence, as somebody who has always said the right things at the right time and for the right reason. General Rawat, welcome to this summit. Our topic today is aptly chosen: securing Fortress India. And who better to speak to on this subject than yourself? I just want to begin with something that's been in the news over the last few days. And this is claims that we're losing or we are lost territory in Arunachal, in a particular area, to Chinese who are making villages, etc., and intruding. And a lot of people are saying that we're, again, seeing the kind of situation that we saw in Ladakh, etc., and Galwan. So what really is happening there, and what's your insight?
This issue about Chinese building villages, along the line of actual control is true. But what I wish to come out with is, Chinese are building villages possibly for billeting and locating their civilians or for their military in the future, all along the line of actual control, particularly after the recent face-offs that we've had. But this present controversy that has erupted, that Chinese have come across into our territory and have built a new village, is not true. What the Chinese have done is that they've got posts on their side of the line of actual control, and we've got posts on our side facing each other. Yeah, wherever the Chinese have now developed their posts, we have seen some old dilapidated huts that existed in that area, where mainly, the labor supporting the Chinese state, because Chinese bank a lot of civilian labor for construction of their infrastructure and construction of their, other assets for supplying the soldiers who live on these posts on the LAC. So now some of those huts have been broken and newer infrastructure is being built up. Modern huts are coming up. Yes, maybe a couple of them villages have increased in size. What I would probably feel is that these are to billet maybe the Chinese soldiers. Subsequently, they may also be planning to facilitate arrival of their families once in a while, because they do see at times our civilians going there, our families visiting forward areas at times. So they are watching all this. Now the Chinese soldier is isolated. He comes from mainland China. He's living thousands of miles away from his mainland. So, and he's seeing our people that, they are in a much happier state. They get to go home much faster. Our soldiers do get, leave to go home and, from the line of actual control positions at least twice in a year, if not thrice. Chinese soldiers don't have this luxury. So they are building this infrastructure, these kind of so-called villages, which are well within their side of the LAC. They have not transgressed anywhere on our perception of the line of actual control. There are different perceptions. We are very clear where the line of control lies, line of actual control lies, because we have been told that this is your alignment of the line of actual control and this is the territory you are expected to defend. Chinese have a perception which in some areas we know, in some areas we don't know, because they have never really explained where the line of actual control lies according to their perception. But as far as we are concerned, there is no such village development that has taken place on our side of the line of actual control.
So where did this come out of, this entire claim? And of course, there are people who are now saying that, look, we've been there from 1959, etc. We had yesterday a Minister of State for Law, Mr. Kiren Rijiju, coming out and saying that, and he knows the area, of course. So where did this come out of? And
you see, people now have access to satellite images through Google, through various other systems that are operating. So every time a Google image comes out, you see the development that has happened on that side, which was not available to people some years ago. So now with this kind of facility that is available, people start seeing these villages, these huts coming up. They think it is something new. It is becoming new because you were not aware of the existence of such villages earlier. And yes, I would say that earlier these were some kind of thatched huts where the Chinese lived or their graziers lived. but now they have converted them into some kind of a permanent infrastructure. So it gives an impression as if a new village has come up. It is just that old infrastructure is being redeveloped to make it little more comfortable and make it more conducive to the accommodation that they are building for their own soldiers or their civilians alike.
So it's not muscle flexing on their part. It's just a convenience issue. Is that what you're saying?
Certainly not. I wouldn't call it muscle flexing. It is development of the villages. They are trying to make sure that they reach out to their border areas, something which we should also be doing. We are also concerned about our border area development, and government has released funds for BADP projects. In fact, we are encouraging people to go up and stay back in their villages, because large number of villages along the LAC are being vacated. And why are they being vacated? Because people find job opportunities, education, health infrastructure more in the rural areas. As we now start developing infrastructure, our roads keep coming up. In fact, the first thing that has to happen is development of roads. The moment the roads come up, you will find education, healthcare will happen. Unfortunately, in our case, for so many years, we did not allow road infrastructure to come up because we thought that in case you develop roads, the Chinese will roll down along these roads. I think that was a misnomer. We have realized that if you have to defend your territory, you need to develop infrastructure for the military to hold on to your territory which they are expected to defend.
Let me press you on that point a little bit more with regards to what's actually happening with regards to talks of disengagement, etc. Now, the last round was on October 10th, and there obviously was not any progress because the Indian press release said, and I quote, during the meeting, the Indian side therefore made constructive suggestions for resolving the remaining areas, but the Chinese side was not, unquote. Do give us an update on how things stand now in Dadaksa.
Yeah, I think you've raised two issues there. One is disengagement and the next is de-escalation. I will deal with these two issues step by step. Firstly is disengagement. You know that after the confrontation that happened in the Galwan Valley in 2020, the Chinese and Indian soldiers have practically come face to face in a number of areas. Now, remaining in this kind of a disposition is fraught with danger, because anywhere you find where troops are in close proximity, it could lead to an ugly situation anytime because of misgivings by either side. So we therefore, first thing we want to do is we want disengagement to happen, and so that the separation of the troops increases. We don't want troops to be in so close proximity. So that has happened in almost all areas. You know what happened in Pangong Tso? The Chinese have fallen back behind finger 8, we've fallen back behind finger 4. So yes, in between there is a moratorium on patrolling, but we will resume patrolling as far as we are able to achieve disengagement in all these sectors. So this is a process. Today there is no area other than, I would say, Nathula, where we've had presence on both sides, where soldiers today are really facing each other in close proximity. So that has been achieved. Yes, we want some more distance to be brought into separation, so that the troops that are separating each other are at a greater proximity, because the chances of escalation on both sides rushing again onto the closer proximity of each other can happen. So to avoid that, we are saying that can we now go back to original positions where we earlier were before this escalation happened? Because gradually what happened was, when the Chinese came forward, we moved forward. They came further ahead, we moved further ahead. And that is how the proximity situation evolved. Now we have been able to disengage and there has been some separation, but we would be happy to ensure that both people go back to original state, to the original positions which we were occupying prior to April 2020. That is the effort, and that is an ongoing process. To say that there has been a stalemate is because we want both sides to go back to original positions. And at the same time, we want some kind of assurances that these positions will not be reoccupied. Now, you see, this kind of mutual suspicion exists on both sides. So because of the better infrastructure development that has taken place on the Chinese side, we cannot go by equidistant separation. We have to go by equi-time separation. That means if we have to fall back by, let us say, 6 to 8 kilometers, and Chinese also fall back by 6 to 8 kilometers, but they can cover the distance in wheeled transport in about 20 to 25 minutes, and for us it is going to take an hour, then that is not what we call equal separation. We want equal time and distance separation. So on that, there are, some anomalies that keep existing. The Chinese say, why should I go back so far behind? You should be equidistant. We say, no, we have to go by time. They say, let's go by distance. So this is where, some kind of give and take is happening. But finally, our effort is to make sure that we follow what we want. We will not budge because we are concerned about Chinese reoccupying these positions. And now that, this thing happened in April 2020, the escalation happened. Now there is suspicion on both sides, and we are now more suspicious because once bitten, twice shy. We are not going to allow our guard down at any time, and we will make sure that we are able to reach out back to our position in a time frame which is faster than the Chinese, certainly not later than them. So that is where in some areas you find that the de-escalation process, disengagement process has been slow. I now come to the de-escalation process. Now, de-escalation process implies both sides have amassed large number of troops on each side of the line of actual control, maybe in some depth areas. Chinese have started building some kind of permanent infrastructure. When you build tunnel defenses, when you build silos for storing your ammunition and weapon systems, these are permanent in nature. So if Chinese are going to stay there permanently, we have to be there permanently. We have also inducted some troops into Ladakh and other forward areas. We are not going to move out from there and will not allow de-escalation till we find that there is some kind of a settlement with the Chinese and they are willing to take back troops and fall back to original situation as existed in April 2020. But as of now, I would say de-escalation appears to be far-fetched because the kind of infrastructure that the Chinese have developed, the kind of infrastructure and induction of troops that we have carried out, it will take a long time to reach status quo. So I think disengagement is likely and will happen, but this kind of de-escalation will take time.
So that's interesting. You're making a distinction between disengagement and de-escalation, and what you're saying is that let's forget about this de-escalation for the time being.
That's right.
So what is the time period then that you're sort of looking at for de-escalation? Is it, let's be a little direct, is it completely off the table now?
No, it is not completely off the table. We are saying that, in fact, we've said, can we do disengagement and de-escalation simultaneously? Well, our thought process is we should not do it simultaneously. First should be disengagement, so that at least the cross proximity positions are taken care of. There is no fear about re-escalation of the situation or coming back to same positions. Once that is resolved, then we can look at de-escalation. To say that, Indian Army cannot maintain troops at this altitude and we will have a problem, well, we have no problem. We maintained them last winter. We are quite capable of maintaining them this winter and in times to come. Government has given up adequate resources to make sure that our troops are comfortable. Our stocking is going on at a very rapid pace. In fact, we've already stocked for the winter for the entire lot. We've got adequate resources to combat the adversary should he indulge in any misadventure. And of course, for our Air Force to induct, it is very easy. In fact, our Air Force can operate from bases which are along the valley floor. So we have a tremendous advantage vis-a-vis our adversary in most of these areas.
So if it comes down to a war of attrition, we're well prepared. That's what you're saying. We're well prepared, and we're not in any hurry to de-escalate either, because we can maintain our forward positions.
Yes, I think, you've heard this from the Chief of the Army Staff, you've heard this from the Chief of the Air Staff, and of course from the Chief of the Naval Staff. We are well prepared for any misadventure by our adversary on the border or in the high seas.
So no other Galwans will happen because we're well prepared to retaliate.
See, Galwan to happen is not in our hands. Whether a Galwan will happen or not is not up to us. It is for the Chinese. Chinese can carry out a Galwan again. But should they carry out a Galwan again, they will get it in the same coin that they got it last time.
It has been said that you're undertaking a very ambitious restructuring of the army, etc., the commands. How key is this Indian military reorganizing itself into integrated theatre commands towards securing India, sir?
Well, theatre commands have actually become a necessity for our country. because, we've got two adversaries with unsettled borders. So you've got to make sure that to deal with the northern adversary, you need a single commander to look at the operational situation there. And he must have the resources from all the three services under command and under his control, so that we can find if you can put in a joint effort in an integrated manner to deal with the situation that may evolve on the line of actual control. Similarly, on a western front, again with Pakistan, we need to put up a united joint front. And that can only happen if you have one theatre commander looking at one battlefront against one adversary, and one theatre commander looking at one battlefront against the other adversary. I would like to look at the past, look at the experience that we have gained from our past wars. We fought a war in 1962. In 1962, it was fought by the army on the land. The Air Force was kept out of battle. Why did that happen? Is because the political hierarchy that time felt that the Air Force should not be utilized, because if we utilize the Air Force, the adversary China can do more damage to us through their air power. That is because there was possibly a lack of understanding of this integrated joint warfare. And there was no commander, single commander to advise the government on how joint warfare is fought. If at that time we had a joint commander or a unified commander, integrated theatre, who could have advised that battle has to be fought on air and land simultaneously. That is why we call it an air-land battle. And had we utilized the Air Force, then the enemy which was rumbling down the hills of Arunachal Pradesh in the Tawang tract could have been dealt, a severe blow could have been dealt to the adversary with the air power. It was not used. It's because we were all working in vertical silos. You look at the 65 operations. The air played a major role, although 65 operation is not much talked about. But our Air Force, with a much lesser air combat capability vis-a-vis the Pakis. The Pakistanis had better aircraft vis-a-vis ours. Yet we were able to suppress the Pakistani Air Force on the western front. And finally, coming down to the 71 operations. 71 operations, the integrated theatre battle and joint employment of forces is seen in Bangladesh, erstwhile East Pakistan and now Bangladesh, where you had an army commander called General Lakhjit Singh Arora, who was actually responsible for the land forces and took control and made the overall plan, along with his Air Force and naval component commanders, who were, Krishnan and Diwan, the two naval and Air Force component commanders. But that time what happened was, the military was told as early as April 71 that something needs to be done to prevent the refugee situation from overflowing into our country and to prevent the terrorist atrocities and the kind of atrocities that were being committed by East Pakistan or the Pakistani army against the population of East Pakistan. So we were given this task as early as April 71. But then, the three chiefs who were there with Manekshaw in the lead, he advised the government that very soon the monsoon will come. We need some time to prepare. And we will decide the time for fighting the war. In the meantime, the Bangladesh Mukti Johidas, or the Mukti Bahini, they had started dealing with the Pakistan army in East Pakistan and it started weakening them, gathering information about them. So a large amount of intelligence was available to us through the Mukti Johidas and our own intelligence operatives operating there. So finally, when we decided to go into war in December, because Pakistan initiated the war on the Western Front on 3rd of December, and we went into the war, you found that it was an integrated battle which was fought. The land forces and the air forces were operating in a very joint manner. It was kind of an air-land battle. Both the commanders at some stage decided, if you have to race to Dhaka, then you must do an air-land battle, and we did the Tangel landings. That is when 2 paras were dropped there with the Air Force and the land forces that linked with them, and we were able to reach Dhaka. Navy at the time was told that you must blockade the Chittagong port and make sure that nobody can escape from that site. So what happened there was that the 93,000 prisoners of war booty that we got was because the Navy ensured that no escape route was available from the sea route, otherwise these people would escape. So Navy was doing the task based on the overall plan that had been made. Air Force was supporting the ground forces in the operation. This was a classic example of a theatre battle. And when the battle had been won, the surrender was taken and decided upon by the Eastern Theatre Commander. There was no interference happening from the army headquarters. The three chiefs here were advising the government keeping the government informed what is happening, resourcing the theatre commanders in the way they wanted to be resourced. Now you found that by about 7th or 8th December, when the Pakistani Air Force had been completely decimated in the Eastern Theatre, a decision was taken that some of the Air Force from here could come to the support in the Western Theatre, because we had suffered a setback in Longewala, where the Chinese had launched Pakistanis had launched a very major offensive with their mechanized forces. So the same Air Force was then diverted westward and utilized to blunt the offensive in Longewala. But here again what happened? In the Western Front, you didn't have a theatre battle being fought. You had a Western Army commander operating from Simla, looking at the Western sector, and you had a Southern Army commander operating from Pune, looking at the desert sector. Now, while you were making very good gains in the Western sector, we were almost knocking on the doors of Sialkot and Lahore on the Western sector. But we were suffering some setbacks in the Southern sector in Longewala, and initially in Bhuj also there was some action that had taken place. So what happened was, the resources were diverted, Air Force was decided to Longewala, because it was each, I would say, army commander, calling for assistance, and somebody in Delhi taking a call. Had there been one theatre commander looking after the Western Front, maybe he would have decided, never mind if I lose Longewala, so long as I get Sialkot and Lahore in my pocket, which would have been better. I feel if there had been a theatre commander, the decision to support the operations in Longewala maybe would have gone in favor of pressing on the offensive towards Sialkot and Lahore, which would have been advantageous. And subsequently, we could have still come and maybe, yes, lost Longewala, but recaptured it. So you have to look at, where the value territory lies, where the value objective lies. This can only happen if you have one commander, because here the Southern Army commander thought, oh my God, for me, if I lose Longewala, it's blood on my face. So, I must make sure. So he was crying hoarse to get support, and he was given the support. But then you lost the advantage that you were gaining. You were at Nanakot, knocking the doors of Sialkot, and Sialkot was there for you to take. In the meantime, the ceasefire was called in the eastern sector. So the war had to be called off, and that is where the situation lies today.
Now, time is of the essence, obviously, and I'm speaking with regards to China again. So what is the timeline, very quickly? And my next question, obviously, General Rawat, after you answer that one, is on, again, this new land law that has been promulgated by China for border areas, which came into effect, as you know, on October 23. Now, how does this complicate the resolution of the border standoff? Because what we've seen by the way of statements in Xinhua, which is their official media outlet, that they are very, very focused on holding on to territory, strengthen their border defense, support economic and social development, as well as opening up border areas. So they're not in any hurry to de-escalate, to borrow from you. So this really messes things up. So first timeline, and then this Chinese challenge.
See, Chinese are reaching out to the border areas which they claim as their territory. So long as they remain themselves confined to their side of the line of actual control, as we perceive it, we have no objection. But if they are going to transgress and come into our side of the territory, then it is a cause for concern. But to come to our side of the line of actual control is not easy, because we are manning practically every region along the line of actual control, and we have got effective means to maintain surveillance. What the Chinese are doing is trying to stake their claim by coming out with historical facts. I think this is something which we should also be doing. What is stopping us from reaching out to our border areas, putting our population in those areas? That is what I said. The first thing that needs to be done is develop the surface infrastructure, which I think is now happening at a rapid pace. If we are able to do that, we should be then able to convince our people that you must stay back in your villages, but for that we will give you good medical care, we will create healthcare facilities, education facilities. And I think if we open these areas for tourism, there is enough scope for adventure tourism in this area, which we can open up. So far, we've been very reserved and conservative in allowing our civilians to move the border. I think as a quid pro quo, we need to do the same thing.
But General Saab, you yourself said that, the LAC is not defined. And the Chinese think that perhaps some of our territory belongs to them, and they have made these claims. Now, the problem with this border law, according to Lieutenant General D.S. Huda, for example, he says that this law makes China's borders sacred and inviolable. But that is a disadvantage.
See, that's what I said. As of now, we are talking of the line of actual control. If they are going to transgress the line of actual control, if with this they are able to define the line of actual control for us, it is to our advantage. We have been telling the Chinese, can you tell us the alignment of the line of actual control as perceived by you? They have so far not told us. But now by this analogy, if they are going to actually define the line of actual control and say, this is my border, I think it should work to our advantage. But if they are going to say the line of actual control transgresses the so-called line of actual control, which we have laid down and defined for ourselves, then it's a cause of concern and we will not allow that to happen. We are ensuring that we maintain regular surveillance in these areas. If you think the Chinese can just
are you
walk
saying,
in,
sir, that at some point, because look, when a law is promulgated in China, and this is what people are saying, it is not an open democracy where, you'll have clamor from public to reappeal laws, you'll have courts that might look into it. They will make their claim and they will say, we will, as some people have said, like General Huda, that this is now sacred and inviolable. Sorry, take it or leave it. What are we going to do? Is conflict inevitable?
okay, what has our government said in Parliament about our territory? Therefore, we are saying that is sacred. We have said Jammu and Kashmir state completely belongs to us. It has been quoted in Parliament. So we have already defined a boundary. We have defined what Chinese are saying is something after we have said. We have defined a boundary that as far as Ladakh is concerned, this is our claim line, this is our border, or this is the territory that belongs to us. So if that be so, then is it that we have defined our borders and we have said this is our borders? If he is going to now have overlapping claim lines, then of course there will be contestation.
Who poses the greatest threat, in your assessment right now, to Fortress India, to India's national sovereignty, sir?
Obviously, the northern neighbor China.
So it is the enemy number one, you would say?
You should have no doubt in that. I think everybody has said so. That we for too long focused on our Western adversary, whereas very many years ago our government has been saying your major threat lies in the north. I mean, we are well aware of that, and therefore the complete focus over the years has been shifting. We created additional forces for the Northern Theatre. We have created a Mountain Strike Corps. After all, this is something that not only us, very many years ago, people realized that the threat is emerging on the northern borders.
Well, the Chinese are also, of course, deepening their engagement with Pakistan. And the Pakistanis obviously did not come for this particular meeting that the NSA had just yesterday in Afghanistan, which is another area of concern now. The Chinese, as you know, stayed away. They're meeting today, the two of them, with the US representative across the border. This clearly tells you that they're working in tandem now. And I want to ask you, sir, what should India be doing with regards to Afghanistan? Our concern is if the Chinese get in there, the Pakistanis get in there, there'll be strategic depth, and that'll give them greater strategic autonomy to do things against India. There's a big debate about whether we should engage the Taliban, diplomatically recognize them, or let them stew for a little while and open a direct sort of, contact with the Afghani people, give them relief directly, ignore the Taliban. What is it that you recommend?
Don't you think what happened yesterday has been a complete game changer in this entire game on Afghanistan? You've got the NSAs of all the northern neighbors of Afghanistan in India talking together in one language, one voice, including Iran. So with this kind of a masterstroke has been played by our government, I think it has completely upset the apple cart that the Afghans with the Chinese and the Taliban, I would say, in Afghanistan, with the Chinese and Pakistanis were playing. I think they have seen the kind of mechanism that India has adopted to bring back its stake in Afghanistan. I think this has been a masterstroke by our government.
At the same time, let me ask you, given the fact that the Haqqanis now obviously are part of this regime, and we know that the Haqqani network has been long nursed by Pakistan, Are we now seeing a situation, General Rawat, where there is going to be an escalation of some sort of cross-border terror attacks? Because these are all assets, the Pakistani military, and they played such a big role in installing the Taliban. Are we going to see a period now of some amount of conflict across the LAC in Kashmir?
Well, we have numerous internal security challenges in our country. There are a large number of insurgent and terrorist groups which are operating. This will add yet another dimension to the terrorist threat that is looming large on our borders. To say that some of the, Lashkar-e-Toiba or the Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorists who have been associated with the Pakistan Taliban are not going to infiltrate into India would be far-fetched. They certainly will, and they will come with some sophisticated weapons and other systems. We have dealt with this situation earlier, and we will continue to deal with this situation. We are prepared for the countering this kind of infiltration. If they find other means of reaching our country, we will deal with them. It is not the first time we are dealing with Afghans or other foreign nationals operating in the Kashmir Valley. They have operated earlier. You see, today what is happening in Kashmir is that there is a kind of frustration that is setting in amongst the militant ranks. That's why you find they are changing strategy. They have now started getting after the locals, maybe locals of a different community. But there is anger brewing amongst the people. If you have to, for any terrorist or an insurgent organization to succeed, it needs support of the local people. The moment you wean the local people away from you, which the security forces have been successful, and the terrorists are, I think, doing a great blunder by what they are doing. Ultimately, in the long term, they will lose this battle they are trying to fight. But what we are talking of, targeted killings and exodus happening, every time the apple season gets over, a large number of labor moves out of the valley. This happens every year. So this year, if some people are going out, it is the apple season is over. Apple has been plucked. And now that labor is returning back. They come back again in March, April, when the season again. In the winter months, no outside labor wants to stay in Kashmir, except for a few who are working on, as local household support.
No, but sir, that's fine. I take your point. But should these people be show-caused by the state administration?
See, they have been show-caused not because of that. They have been show-caused to say, we can provide you safer haven if you are willing to come into safer havens. And therefore, the state government is actually providing them safer haven that if you feel threatened, rather than carrying out an exodus that happened earlier, don't do that. You come to us, we can provide you safer havens, and that is what we are looking at. In fact, we as security forces have offered to the local population that anybody who feels threatened, please come to us, we will provide you temporary shelter.
Instead of using this officious sort of, sending a notice, etc., you could have made a general appeal. It could have been handled better. More sensitively?
See, I still won't say it could have been handled better. It has been handled reasonably well. What they are trying to say is, if you feel threatened and you have alternate method of living, but don't leave your base here. What we are saying is, like earlier what happened was, people left their bases and left, and which was taken over by the Kashmiri terrorists there. Now we don't want that to happen. But if somebody feels, yes, I've got a safer haven in Delhi, I've got some place in Jammu and I want to move there temporarily, move. But others who have no place to go, don't take that call. You come to us, we will protect you. It's a temporary phenomena. We will get over this problem and we will be able to deal with the situation.
Are we doing a good job of protecting them?
Yes, we can protect them, and we are caring for them.
We've had so many attacks.
You see, you had about, 11 to 12 attacks have happened. But these are something, that's what I'm trying to say. What is the adversary trying to do? You don't play into the adversary's head. Adversary wants a mass exodus. You have to make sure that you do not play into this game. He wants you to carry out an exodus. Our aim is to prevent this exodus. Otherwise, you're playing, he does 11, 12 killings and the exodus starts. This is something which we have to prevent. And how are we preventing it? That every terror attack that is happening, anybody who's carrying out the attack, I think within 48 hours to 72 hours, is being eliminated or apprehended. Nobody has been allowed to go scot-free. So the terrorists themselves will soon realize that you are getting caught. Because and how are you getting caught? Obviously, it is local support. Who's giving you the information? The locals. The same locals are giving you information about the terrorists. And in fact, now what we are told is that the locals are saying we'll lynch the terrorists, which is a very positive sign that is coming in. Locals are saying now we'll start lynching the terrorists.
Where does this come out, General Saab?
There is, if you go to the social media, there are now statements coming out that the locals are saying that if you want, we will now start lynching these terrorists because we will not allow this to happen.
So you're saying that the locals are saying that they're going to lynch the terrorists where? When they come into their homes or into their...
No, you see, so far what's been happening is a large number of these locals know where these terrorists are. They know where they are operating. It's the fear of the gun that keeps them, disclosing the information. But now they are coming out with a different analogy to say, either we will lynch them or we'll make arrangement that they get lynched. We will not allow this kind of a thing happen. So this is not something that is being appreciated by the locals. Now, whether this is a message for the terrorists to say that you do this, you will get lynched, and therefore you should not do this. Now, whether it is being played up by the intelligence agencies, I would even then say this is a good card being played. So they that will lynch you.
So to say that locals will lynch terrorists, you think is a good card?
I think it's a good card being played. Why? Because you must put the same fear in the mind of the terrorists. Before you lynch me, I'll lynch you.
But of course, there'll be a whole lobby of human rights activists who will say that you're encouraging this sort of vigilantism.
Hold on, I have said lynching a terrorist, you're calling it, human right violation. If there's a terrorist operating in your area, why should you not lynch him? You should allow him. You should allow. It is like I will quote an example. I will now quote an example.
No, 1 second, General Saab. This is an important point you're making. So you're saying that if there is a terrorist, what's the harm in lynching that terrorist? Now, half the problem is that there are politicians, mainstream politicians in Kashmir who say that the Indian army kills people who they think are terrorists, but actually not terrorists. They're innocent Kashmiris. How do you know someone is a terrorist, and does this give license to the army then to knock off people and claim that they are terrorists, and then they say they were lynched? I'm just saying.
No. What I'm saying is, we are lynching a terrorist. To be identified as a terrorist, he has to be a human being with a weapon. So I am saying that if he is going to carry out an act of terror on somebody, obviously he's doing it with a weapon. Unless he's going to the knife and he's going to slit the throat, which is hidden somewhere, is a different issue. So therefore, if he is carrying a weapon, is likely to carry out an attack. And before that, if I can lynch him, where is the problem? I'll give you an example now. In Sopur, when I was a commander, there used to be convoys passing through, and the intelligence people would tell us that there's likely to be a grenade attack on the convoy. So we would put people in civilian clothes, some intelligence operatives to keep a watch on people. Now you found a chap who's got a grenade in his hand, he's hiding behind his pocket, and he's waiting for the convoy to come. If I lynch him, if I catch him at that time, he goes into a fight with me, and in that fight he takes out his weapon and he threatens me, but before that I fire at him and I kill him. Now the issue is, I have killed an innocent. So what if he had a grenade in his hand? But after he has lobbed the grenade on the vehicle and caused injuries to 2 of my people, now I can kill him. Because now he's a terrorist. With a grenade in hand, intelligence operator was telling me that there is likely to be a grenade attack. I have seen the grenade in his hand. I have lynched him. But in that lynching bargain that is going on, a firefight ensues and he dies.
You are suggesting that there are civilians now, and you think that this is advantageous, who are saying that we are going to lynch terrorists. That will be a decision that will not be taken by any trained army officer. It will be taken by members of civil society. And they will just go out there and lynch people who they will say could be terrorists or may not be terrorists. Who at that moment is going to determine if that was a terrorist or not? That's the question I want to ask.
Now I'll tell you, even in other communities outside Jammu and Kashmir, you have a lot of theft that happens, murders that happen. You find local communities then get together, so we'll do our own local policing along with the civil police. So what happens is they put their own, it happens a lot in villages. If you live in villages, you'll find that a lot of local policing happens because, there are groups that come from other villages to steal cattle. Now when cattle stealing happens, that they find that every day cattle are being stolen, the village community is formed and they say, okay, we will defend ourselves. So people sit down with lathis and say, okay, we will defend ourselves at night. We will sit on guard here, here and here and make sure that our cattle are not stolen. And when the cattle stealers comes, at time, the lathi drill happens. And in that lathi drill, if a civilian dies who's come to steal the cattle, yes, the law takes its own course. But then the law is aware of, under the situation that this happened, is it a human right violation or not? Something that the courts will decide. But the court, when it understands the whole thing, that this has happened under these conditions, I think takes a call based on the situation. This happens everywhere. Why are you only singling out Jammu and Kashmir? People do self-defense everywhere. Self-defense volunteer forces have been created in most villages in our country. It happens in the northeast a lot. where again you have insurgent groups who come for taxation, who come house to house collecting taxes. There are self-defense forces which have been created by the village communities. It's a very common thing in our country.
So let me ask you, you would admit that there might be room here for abuse of this process. Would you at least
You are
admit
calling it abuse. I am not calling it abuse. I am saying when a terrorist has started committing abuse, I am countering it.
Okay.
I am not you are not calling the other side abuse. I am saying the terrorist here has started perpetrating fear and has actually executed people. People have been killed. Now here in self-defense also people can do nothing. This is an act of self-defense. Today somebody is saying they are going to come to my village. I don't know whom they will kill next. It could be me. So here the community which says we will defend ourselves on our own, and you are calling it.
Right. I'm not. I'm apprehending what people might say.
I have clarified it. I am saying this is self-defense. Every man has a right to self-defense in our constitution and according to the law.
Let's talk along those lines. Obviously, all of this is happening, these targeted killings, and they're identity-based. There's no point now denying it. Now, in that context, sir, this seems to suggest that there are two ideologies that are grating against each other, and you've talked about this Cynic Islamic alliance that is also taking root. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, I am only looking at some theses that somebody has propagated. And I was talking about Samuel P. Huntington, who wrote a thesis in Clash of Civilization, where he said there could be a clash of civilizations. So I said, and he said the clash of civilizations will happen along fault lines. And one of the fault lines he identified was the area of Persia. Now Iraq and Afghanistan, this is the belt they talked about. So is it likely to happen, or is it already happening? We may say, we don't believe in the clash of civilizations, fine. But are you very sure the other countries don't believe in the clash of civilizations, and clash of civilizations will not happen? It's something which we have to wait and watch. Will it happen or not? I mean, we've seen empires coming because of clash of civilization. There has been an Ottoman Empire. There was a caliphate. There are people who are saying we want to revive the caliphate. What is the revival of the caliphate? It is clash of civilizations. It will lead to clash of civilizations if the caliphate is to be revived.
So I just want to ask you, General Saab, because the EM, Mr. Jaishankar, said that India has never believed in the clash of civilizations. Has India never believed in the clash of civilizations? Do you agree with him?
Well, we have been a very tolerant nation. Anybody who has entered our nation, we have welcomed them. And today we are in that situation where we've lived with all the communities. But clash of civilizations happens when you start throwing out people. I would say a clash of civilization in a very minor term happened in Kashmir.
And it is majorly happening in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, where that minorities are being targeted and kicked out.
I would even refer to that as a clash of civilization.
So would you then go on to say that perhaps the CAA, the law is a reaction to this clash of civilizations, this clash of ideologies?
Yes.
Would you say that the CAA is also been drawn up to mitigate against this?
No, CAA has been drawn up to amalgamate and make it one country. We say we are one nation, one flag.
So these are the victims of the clash of civilizations.
So that is all part of making sure that we are a very tolerant community.
Right.
We believe in amalgamating all societies, all communities, all religious denominations under one flag, one umbrella, one constitution. That is what we are looking at.
How do you see AUKUS, General?
Well, AUKUS has got some military connotations. Quad has none of those. Quad is something which has got more to do with Sagar. When we look at security and growth for all in the region, that is what Quad is all about. We are looking at making sure that in this particular region, there are 4 democratically elected governments which have come together to mitigate the problems of everybody else in the region, especially when you face HADR. Now you have this pandemic. These things will continue to occur. So there are nations who are haves and the have-nots. It is between the haves trying to support the have-nots to make sure that there is equal security and growth for everybody. AUKUS is a completely different issue. AUKUS is giving, some kind of a military power to one nation, that is Australia, for them to operate. So you can't compare these two at all.
But do you believe that the Quad needs to equip itself militarily also at some level to counter Chinese aggression?
I think presently the way we are working with Quad is working absolutely fine. Alongside Quad, but very different from that, we are carrying out joint exercises with a number of nations, some of which are members of the Quad, some outside the members of the Quad.
So the formation of the Quad doesn't preclude military cooperation. That's what you're saying?
No, I don't say that. I am saying that military cooperation is happening with nations even beyond the Quad. We've just had HMS Elizabeth from England, UK, participating in a joint exercise with us. It is not member of the Quad. So to confine this only to Quad would be incorrect. Exercises and whatever role we are playing with the other armed forces is a very different issue. Quad has a completely different connotation and different purpose.
General Saab, thank you very much. Candid as always, forthright as always. Thank you very much, sir.